Chapter 3 of the Dalehouse Murder by Francis Everton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganand. The Dalehouse Murder. Chapter 3. Stella murdered. Stella dead. Stella poisoned. I think that, apart from Margaret, who sat silent after her one piercing cry of alarm, we none of us quite realized the horror of the situation, and I am sure that we none of us understood the doctor's muttered references to a mistake, or gave any thought to the manner of her death. Nothing in the scene before us suggested tragedy. The sun shone in at the 3 long windows which were opened wide, and one of the 2 family cats sat leisurely washing her face on the sill, the drowsy hum of the bees at work in the garden border below making a fitting accompaniment of her deliberate, graceful movements. The breakfast table was in the homely disorder of a completed meal, and we sat round it in flannels prepared for tennis. Kenneth was still arrayed in cap and gown. The golf clubs, the shoe trees, and the tennis and golf balls collected from Ethel's bed lay heaped together in one of the 2 armchairs. None of these things suggested tragedy and death, but poor beautiful Stella lay dead upstairs. Only yesterday I had watched her playing vigorous tennis, and one little picture stood out clearly in my mind. She had stooped low to ground to reach the ball, a bare arm sweeping gracefully at its fullest stretch, a lovely pose, as, lightly poised, she held a balance with one white-clad shapely leg reaching out behind, tip of toe and fingertips of a free hand just touching the ground, her coppery hair showing little pools of sun-kissed ruddy gold. Her amber eyes alight with pure enjoyment as she gave a little involuntary cry of pleasure when the ball, curving low, just skimmed the net. All made a vivid picture of joyous, slim agility, and that was only a few hours ago, but now, while we had been fooling round the breakfast table, she lay stiff and cold and dead. Kenneth took off his cap and gown, but for once Ralph was the first to speak. "Look here, we can't just sit round the table gaping. What did the tundish mean by a mistake? Where is he, and where on earth is Ethel? I'm going out to find someone." I tried to persuade him to wait a few minutes, as the doctor had so particularly asked us to stay until he came back, and we sat silent again. Then Ralph wondered why on earth didn't he want us to leave the room, and Kenneth made for the door, saying that he for one wasn't going to be told what he could and he couldn't do at a time like this. Fortunately, Ethel came back before he reached it and added a request to mine. She told us that the doctor was in the dispensary examining the bottles from which she had made up Stella's sleeping draught, and that he would be with us in less than 5 minutes. She went over to Kenneth and put one hand on his shoulder as she spoke, saying, "Oh, it's all too dreadful. We must try to help the tundish all we can. It's simply terrible for him." "Do you mean that he has made a mistake then?" Kenneth replied, and I was surprised to hear how hard and harsh his voice was. No hint of sympathy softened the bluntness of his question, and Ethel's hand fell slowly from his shoulder. The door opened, and the tundish came in. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at Kenneth with as sad a smile as ever I wished to see. "No," he said, "I don't think I've made any mistake, but I have very serious news for you. Will you please sit down?" He took the chair at the end of the breakfast table again as he spoke, motioning to Ethel to come and sit beside him. His arm was resting on the table, and I saw her put her hand against it with a timid little touch of sympathy which he acknowledged with a smile of thanks. Kenneth saw it too and reddened and said in an unnaturally formal voice, "Now, doctor, we are anxious to hear what you have to tell us." I could have kicked him for the way he said it, and I think that was the first time that it crossed my mind that he might be jealous of the tundish. The doctor took no notice of his remark, but proceeded immediately to tell us in a calm, friendly voice that, as we already knew, he had made up an ordinary sleeping draught for Stella the night before. The medicine had been taken up to her bedroom and placed on a little table by a bed by the maid, Annie, just before supper. It had consisted of a mild narcotic taken from one of the bottles that stood on the lower shelf of the poison cupboard, to which he had added 1 or 2 other ingredients which it was not necessary for him to specify, as they were entirely harmless in their action. Every prescription, he explained, was registered in a special book kept for the purpose in the dispensary as soon as it was made up, and this he had done in the usual way. The draught was a mild one, and there was no possibility that by itself could have caused death or have had any harmful action. He had just roughly checked over the contents of each of the bottles he had used, and they each of them contained exactly what they were alleged to contain. He told us how the poison cupboard, in addition to the stock poisons that were placed on the lower shelf, held a number of rare and some of them very dangerous poisons collected by Dr. Hansen over a long period in connection with his research work on a shelf at the top. These were seldom touched, and it had not been necessary for him to handle them in making up the sleeping draught for Stella. As far as he could tell, they had not been disturbed. Here he turned to me, saying, "But you may be able to help us there, Jeffcock, for you saw them with me only the night before last. You had better come along and tell me if, as far as you can remember, they were still placed as they were then." We trooped into the dispensary, and he opened the heavy steel door of the cupboard with a little key which he took from his waistcoat pocket. The bottles, apparently, were in the exact positions in which I had seen them only 2 nights before, the tiny Chinese flagon lifting its long slender neck with its queer flat stopper above the diminutive bottles that surrounded it. As far as I could recollect, it was in the identical place in which I had placed it when the tundish had so urgently begged me to put it down, but, as I explained, any of the other bottles might have been changed or moved about, for they were all identical in shape and size, and I had not taken any note of the names and formulae on the neatly written labels. "As far as we can see, then, the Chinese flagon has not been moved?" the tundish asked. "Do you think that you would be prepared to swear to that?" I hesitated before I replied. "No, I don't think I could swear to it, but I could state an oath that if it has been put back again in very nearly the exact position in which I saw it last." I pointed out, however, that unless some of the other bottles were moved as well, it would be practically impossible to have put it down anywhere else, and I finished up by asking him if the Chinese flagon were particularly important. "Yes," he said, "it is. I'm convinced that someone or other has added some of the contents of that little bottle to the draught which I made up for Stella, and that is the cause of her death." He spoke in his quiet, precise voice, as though he had been making some trivial statement in general conversation, but the rest of us were too astonished to say anything at all. "Come, time presses," he added after a pause. "Let us go back to the dining room." As soon as we were seated again in our old positions, he repeated to the rest what he had told me with regard to the history of the weird little Chinese bottle and the action of its deadly contents. He explained to us how in China he had seen a man who had been poisoned by it, that Stella's appearance was exactly similar, and that he knew of no other poison which produced even approximately similar symptoms. He feared, although he had of course only had time for a brief examination, that there was little if any likelihood of his opinion being incorrect. We sat nerved and taut, as one sits looking for the lightning flashes in a violent storm, and it was Margaret who first broke the silence. I noticed that she was holding to the table edge, and her fingertips were white with the pressure of her grip. "Did Stella know of the Chinese flagon?" she asked. "No, not to my knowledge," he replied. "Besides which, it is difficult to see how she could have got at it had she wished to do so. There are only the 2 keys to the cupboard, mine and Miss Summerson's. Mine I can answer for, and Miss Summerson left the dispensary yesterday afternoon at 3 o'clock in order to go over to Millingham to see some friends of hers. I gave her special leave for the purpose, and she is not to return until midday today. She always carries the key on a chain attached to her waist, and is a model of care in such matters." "Then you really do suspect foul play?" I asked. "But who could have done it, and what motive could they have had?" "Yes, I suspect foul play. Murder, in short, to use the horrid word, but I am not able to answer the rest of your question. The position, as I see, is this. Besides the 6 of us sitting here at this table, there were only 2 maids in the house last night after the medicine was taken upstairs, making 8 in all. Of the 8, obviously suspicion falls most readily on me, as I made the medicine up, but I can assure you most positively that no mistake was made with the prescription. So far as I know, Annie, who carried it upstairs, does not even know of the existence of the little flagon, and I think that we can probably rule her out of it. Of the rest of you, suspicion points most readily to you, Jeffcock, for I told you all about the poison only the night before, and to you, Ethel, who already knew about it from your father." He put his hand over hers and smiled at her as he spoke, but Kenneth sprang up at once, crying out angrily, "How dare you make such a suggestion about Miss Hanson?" "Don't be a fool, Kenneth," she replied tersely. "And I was Ethel to the tundish when you were a little boy at school." The doctor stood up, all pleasant serenity. I do think I was very careful to say that suspicion pointed most readily to me. But we are delaying too long, and there are things that must be done. The police must be informed. They will have to investigate the matter. And so this is perhaps the last opportunity we shall have of talking quietly together. Stella has been killed unmercifully and in cold blood. It seems impossible to believe, but terrible if it is true, that the murderer is probably here with us in this room now. Possibly you're wondering, even as I am talking to you, whether I am the murderer, and whether I could have nerve enough to face you all like this. Well, I want to beg and pray of you that you will put all such thoughts on one side, for if we once allow our imagination to run riot and let our suspicions get the better of our friendships and beliefs, these next few days may grow memories that we shall all look back on with nothing but shame and regret. I do solemnly swear to you that I did not do this terrible thing. If I am arrested on suspicion, remember that suspicion may still fall on you. We shall all be questioned again and again by the police. If any information should come to light to ease my own position, then it may equally throw suspicion on one of the rest of you. I don't for one moment suggest that we should do anything to hinder their investigations, but apart from that, for God's sake, let us keep our heads and admit no one guilty until his or her guilt has been actually proved. I think that we were all impressed by the earnest way in which he spoke, and Ethel went up to him and kissed him there in front of us all. Of course you didn't do it, Tundish dear, she said, and no one who knows you could think so for a moment. Kenneth said, Oh, yes, that's all very well, but doesn't it apply equally to us all? Why, of course it does. Who suggested that it didn't? But unless the doctor is mistaken about the poison, one of us must have done it. You simply can't get away from that. I said, I'm sure that the doctor is right. The less we think about who it may have been, the better. But I was already thinking of the conversation I had overheard between Ethel and the doctor at the club, and what he and Stella had said in the drawing-room last night. The words, "Your abominable share, father's death, I shall tell them," came whispering in my ears. Ethel had taken a chair again, and I saw the tears well up in her brown eyes as Kenneth was speaking, and then suddenly she buried her face in her arms. The Tundish put his hand on her shoulder, saying, Now, we must waste no more time. First, the servants must be told. Ralph, please ring the bell. And I must telephone or wire to Stella's people. What's her address, Ethel? It's in Kensington. She lives with her uncle, Mr. Crawford, but she told me only yesterday that he is away and that the house is shut. I haven't the least idea where he has gone to, or what his address is now. Whatever shall we do? Oh, don't worry about that. The police will see to it for us. Very likely she may have some letter stating where he is. We will tell them directly they come. Annie, the maid who had taken the fateful medicine upstairs the night before, appeared with a tray to clear away the things. She was a nice, quiet girl of about 28 who had been with the Ansons for a good 10 years. She put the tray down on the sideboard, saying, Why, what's the matter, Miss Ethel? There's no bad news from Folkestone, I hope, sir. No, Annie, but run downstairs and tell cook that I want her at once. Come back again yourself. The cook was an acquisition of about 6 months. I suppose that it really is impossible for the mere male to appreciate the value of a good servant and to understand how easily the mistress of a house may be willing to allow efficiency to pardon defects in appearance and manner. But I felt that, for myself, I would sooner live on perpetual bread and cheese than suffer the Hanson's cook. Ethel had told me more than one story of her selfish unreasonableness, but had added that she was a good cook, and that they preferred to put up with her rather than risk a month or two of cooking and washing up, with possibly something more disastrous still at the end of it. She came back with Annie, standing just inside the door with her arms folded and her beady black eyes darting from one of us to the other as she took in the scene. Her face was unhealthy, pasty, and a small shapeless nose tilted upward with a mouth that seemed ever to be posed in a disagreeable smirk. The Tundish explained that Miss Freeman had been found dead in her bed, and that, as there was some uncertainty as to the reason of her death, it would be necessary for him to call in the police and for an inquest to be held. Cook, who had been christened with the inappropriate name of Grace, was all alarm and anger in a moment. What, the police in this here house? She said. And the master and mistress away as well. Not if I have anything to do with it, by your leave, sir. I come here with a good character to cook. I did. And if I am to be questioned by the police, I had better pack and be off at once, by your leave, Miss Ethel. and she gave her head a nasty little shake and stood with her arms folded and a smirk on a pale, unwholesome face as she waited for the doctor and Ethel to unite in begging her to stay. But she hadn't bargained for the tundish. "Very well then, Grace, you had better go and pack up your belongings at once, for the police will be here in less than half an hour. I warn you, however, that they will look on your action as being very suspicious, and that they will take you to the police station and ask you any questions they may want to in public, instead of quietly here in private. You can go. And you, Annie?" he added, turning to the younger woman. "Oh, I shall stay, sir." "Well, look here, Annie, I may as well warn you that we are all in a pretty mess. Miss Palfreyman has most certainly been poisoned, and I don't see how she can possibly have poisoned herself. I shall be the object of most suspicion, as it was I who made up medicine for her last night. But you will be suspected too, for you took it upstairs to her room. But neither you nor I will have anything to fear if we answer truly all the questions we are asked. Now, be a good girl and get the table cleared quickly while I ring up the police." The telephone is fixed just outside the drawing-room door on a little bracket in the hall, and he went to it as he finished speaking, but before he reached the instrument, the bell rang sharply. Somebody was calling us. The doctor lifted the receiver, and we could tell at once by his tone of voice, as he replied, that he had been listening to serious news. "Oh, dear, I'm sorry. Yes, of course, I'll come at once. I'll put a few things together and be with you as soon as I can." He replaced the receiver and stood thinking deeply. Then he explained to us that he had been called to an urgent case, a case that he could not possibly hand over to another doctor, at least not without seeing him first. He could do nothing for Stella, and it was his obvious duty to go. Would I ring up the police? "And by the way," he added, "you, Ralph, had better run up to the courts and scratch all your names from the tournament. You need not give too much information. Tell them that Miss Palfreyman is ill, and that the rest of you have decided to scratch on account of the heat. We can then be guided by the police when they come. We must all of us remember that this is going to be none too good for your father's practice, Ethel. You ring up the police, Jeffcock, while Ralph goes to the club. I must go at once. There are other people in trouble besides ourselves." He turned at the door to give one look at Ethel, who still sat at the table with her face buried on her arms. "You look after her, Kenneth," he said kindly. But Kenneth looked straight back at him with his lips tight shut and a scowl on his handsome young face, and said never a word in reply. The tundish shrugged his shoulders, made a little grimace, and went off down the passage to the dispensary. I went to the telephone. Now, I had some difficulty in getting my connection, and I dare say I may have stood for a full 5 minutes at the instrument with my back to the hole and the receiver pressed to my ear. The heat was already oppressive, and the delay irritating in itself. My hand, I found, was trembling slightly as I held the receiver. The cathedral clock chimed out 10 as I stood, and I had to look at my watch to make sure that I hadn't missed a chime, for it seemed incredible that only a little more than an hour had passed since the tundish and I sat down to breakfast, and we began the farce of the mock inquiry about the notice that he had stuck up over the landing switch. To look back at the earlier part of the morning was, I felt, like looking at the sunshine receding across the valley as one sat perched on a mountainside with the rain clouds and the thunder drifting up behind. I heard Margaret say that she would go to the basement and fetch something or other for Ethel, and she passed close behind me just as the exchange was putting me through to a wrong number. I had to shout, and it was some time before I could persuade whoever it was speaking to me to hang up his receiver. The girl at the exchange seemed to pay no attention to my repeated attempts to attract her attention. Then, just as I did get the number I wanted at last, I fancied that I could hear someone coming softly down the stairs behind my back, but my attention being all for my message, I did not turn round to see who it was. Fortunately, I got through to the station superintendent himself without any further delay. I told him briefly how one of the doctor's guests had been found dead in bed, and that Dr. Wallace, the physician in charge of the practice, had asked me to ring him up and tell him that he strongly suspected poison. Would he please send someone round at once along with Dr. Jeffries, the police surgeon, if he was available? He promised me that they would both be round in less than a quarter of an hour. I put down the instrument with a sigh of relief. A step, however small, I felt, had been taken toward knowledge and away from uncertainty and indecision. I turned round to find the tundish standing close behind me in the hall. I was surprised because my hearing is so acute that I am not often taken unawares. I wondered how long he had been standing there quietly behind me. He explained that he had come back to ask me to make quite sure that in his absence no one went up to Stella's room before the police were on the scene. He ought to have locked the room, but I had forgotten. I promised him that I would see to it, and he went back down the passage to the consulting room and out into the Dalehouse lane, his patient apparently living in that direction. Margaret came up the stairs from the basement carrying a tray as we concluded a brief conversation, and I stepped forward to take it from her. Somehow or other I felt every bit as sorry for her as I did for Ethel. She was so soft and feminine, and there had been such a note of horror in that one shrill cry of hers when the tundish had told us so calmly that Stella was dead. And now that she had recovered from her first alarm, she seemed all concerned for Ethel, her blue eyes shining brightly, her deep breast rising and falling, and her hands fluttering against mine as we stood with the tray between us. "How splendid he is," she whispered, looking back at the tundish as he disappeared through the baize door at the end of the passage. "How awful when they arrest him! And what will poor Miss Summerson do?" "Miss Summerson?" I echoed in surprise, but she gave me no explanation, just shook her pretty golden head and turned into the dining room to rejoin the others. We found Kenneth standing awkwardly in front of Ethel. She had been very brave and was recovering again from her little collapse. Margaret sat down at her side and made a drink and did her best to comfort her. "It may be a mistake about the Chinese poison, dear," she said caressingly. "Doctors do mistakes, you know." I remember the doctor's words, however, and how he had described a death like a peaceful slumber, a slumber rendered horrible by staring bloodshot eyes and narrow contracted pupils. There could be no mistaking such a death, I thought. The front door bell rang from the outer gate in the garden wall, and we could hear the tread of feet along the garden path. Annie came up to open the door. We were face to face with the situation at last. The three men who were shown into the room were of strikingly different types. The foremost, Inspector Brown, introduced the other two to us with a wave of his hand. With his flat-topped peaked hat, his dark blue uniform braided with black, and his ruddy, healthy, none too intelligent face, I thought him typical of that section of the police who had been promoted from the helmet and the beat to higher spheres of action. He spoke briskly, however, and to the point. "Dr. Jeffries you know already, I think, Miss Hanson," pointing to a thin, elderly, grey-haired man. "But I have been fortunate in bringing with me Detective Inspector Alport of Scotland Yard, who happens to be in Merchester, and was, as a matter of fact, with me in my room when your message came through. Now we must all of us have painted some sort of a mental picture of the detective of fiction, even if you have never seen the real living article in flesh and blood. But I am not willing to imagine that Detective Inspector Alport of Scotland Yard could hold a place in anybody's mental picture. Without exaggeration, he was the ugliest little man I've ever set eyes on, and yet, scanning him feature by feature, I was only astonished that the tout ensemble was not even more grotesque. Little and undersized, his pale, watery eyes bulged after the manner of those of a great many extraordinarily clever people. His forehead was broad but sloping, and if his skin had not been of such visibly coarse, unhealthy-looking texture, this would have been his one redeeming feature. His nose was bulbous, his mouth sloped all over the place, and his little chin was bunched up into a kind of irregular prominence, which was rendered interesting by reason of an unbelievably regular, circular dimple in the middle. I gazed on him fascinated, and thought at once that for a man so handicapped to be anything higher in the social scale than a lavatory attendant must argue a character and mental equipment to be reckoned with, and I very soon found out that if perhaps I was inclined to exaggerate his apparent deficiencies and defects, I altogether underestimated his brain power and those hidden qualities that compel attention and respect. He took charge of the situation at once, speaking rapidly in a voice of markedly pleasant tone. "Dr. Wallace, I presume?" he said, turning to me. I explained the circumstances of the Tundish's enforced absence and how we had been unable to wire to Stella's uncle. Ethel gave him the uncle's address. "I'll look after that. As you suggest, there may probably be information as to Mr. Crofts' present whereabouts among the unfortunate young lady's papers. If not, they will soon find it for me in London. You can leave it to me, and need not bother further." "But the doctor, it is very unfortunate that he has been called away. But I suppose that he will be back before long? He has no doubt left a note of the address to which he has gone?" I had to confess that I didn't think he had, and Ethel, on being questioned, could only state that, so far as she could gather from what she has heard of his conversation on the telephone, it might be one of three. He pulled down a corner of his funny little moustache and stood biting at it, obviously annoyed. Strange, very strange that he should have left the house, he muttered angrily. However, doctor, you had better examine the unfortunate young lady yourself in the meantime. Perhaps Miss Hansel will be kind enough to show us up to her room. The rest of you will kindly oblige me by not leaving this room until my return. Please call up the servants and keep them here as well. He asked Ethel if the room had been locked up and everything in it untouched, and I explained that the Tundish had told me about how he had left the door unfastened and the instructions he had given me. The little gargoyle frowned his disapproval, turned on his heel and left the room, Ethel, Dr. Jeffreys, and the inspector following. I rang the bell for Annie and the cook. "Little swipe," was Kenneth's comment, and I think we all of us felt that we could endorse it. The maids came up at once. Grace, clad in her outdoor clothes, sat down ostentatiously on the edge of a chair with the feather in her atrocious head, nodding her disapproval and independence. Her whole attitude showed that she considered her term of service to be at an end, and that, far from taking the doctor's advice, another minute would have seen her out of the house. I saw Ethel give a wry little smile. Annie stood respectfully against the wall. Grace, God save the mark, and Annie had barely settled down when we heard footsteps on the stairs. I imagined that it would be Alport and Brown returning with Ethel to ask us the questions we all expected to have to answer, but to my surprise Dr. Jeffreys came in with them as well. Alport came in first, rudely stepping straight in front of Ethel, and his bulging eyes seemed more prominent than ever as he asked me angrily, "Where's the key? You told me Dr. Wallace said that the door of the room was unlocked." The end of chapter 3.